the Gospel today has two very clearly seen themes: light and salt. But since I have preached about light several times in the past month, I will focus today more instead on salt. Given the weather these days, perhaps when we think of salt, we are undoubtedly thinking about salt on the roads, salt in our parking lots, salt on our cars, and of course the salt that we throw on our sidewalks. It's everywhere, literally. And so in the Gospel today, Jesus says, if salt loses its taste, it's good for only being thrown on the ground and trampled underfoot. And how true this is of road salt, since road salt is definitely not good to taste. In fact, it is harmful to eat. It is certainly not derived from sodium, as is table salt, but rather magnesium, potassium, calcium, and a variety of various chemicals. Therefore, the only good this form of salt can be and be used for is to in fact be trampled underfoot and under our car tires. But of course, in saying this, Jesus was not seeking to teach us about road salt, but rather about discipleship. And aside from the times of extreme winter weather, in our modern civilized society, when we think of salt, we think of it primarily as a mere condiment, as in, please pass the salt and pepper, as in one spice amongst many. And thus salt is seen as something that is nice to have around, but it ultimately as something merely extra. Since at a lot of nice restaurants even these days, they don't even bother to put salt or pepper on the table, but rather it's added in the kitchen or by the waiter at the table side. Speaking of which, the Knights of Columbus are hosting a pancake breakfast after Mass today, and while they do a good job in the kitchen, they will probably leave it to you to add salt to your custom omelet and eggs. And that plug aside, the Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts may also know that salt acts as a preservative, which keeps meat from rotting. But honestly, how many of us here today have actually used salt as a preservative in this manner? Probably very few, if any at all. But I say this to illustrate the point that our understanding of salt today is very different than how it was viewed years ago. Back in the days of the Old Testament, no sacrifice was offered to God unless it was first sprinkled and seasoned with salt. And even a mere 50 years ago, in the baptismal rites of the church, babies were given exercise salt in their mouths at their baptisms. And this salt that babies were given was seen as a received symbol of wisdom, as an addition to a reminder to in fact be just that, the salt of the earth. In the second reading of today, St. Paul speaks about wisdom, that it is not determined by lofty words or eloquent speech, but wisdom is found by proclaiming Christ crucified, principally by our actions and a faithful witness. And so, therefore, Christians act as salt insofar as that they preserve the morals of society from rotting and falling into corruption. But it is a sign that we have lost our seasoning, our flavor, when society becomes utterly corrupted and we fail to stand in opposition to that corruption. It is only because salt is divisive that it gives contrasting flavors to food. And with ice, salt acts in a divisive manner insofar as that the molecules of salt get in between the tightly compressed molecules of water, therefore dividing them, turning solid into liquid. And even light shares the same principle of divisiveness, since light is, of course, distinguished from darkness. And yet if we become so worldly that we become indistinguishable from it, then how are we to give witness to the world? Therefore we are reminded by Christ to be a light to the world, that we are to be in the world, certainly, but not of the world. And so it is indeed the fact that the church is holy, and something that is holy is by nature separated from others. And by being separated from the world, it is therefore the church is able to give an effective witness to the world, to bear light to the world. And so, once again, the light of faith, it is a brilliant and shining light. But if it becomes watered down, so to speak, if it has many filters upon it, then that light becomes dimmed, effectively perhaps kind of being hidden and obscured by a bushel basket. Salt is not sugar. Salt is not pepper or any other spice. And so it should not seek to taste like anything that it is not. Jesus did not say that you are the honey of the earth, but rather the salt of the earth. And so no one effectively witnesses to Christ by candy coating, sugar coating, as it were, Christ's message. And so without a doubt, the world is indeed filled with many wounds, broken people, and it is many people in the world that are in need of healing. They need salt. Another aspect of salt that was used in ancient times was in times of war. If you had a wound in the field of war, you poured salt in it to stop infection from spreading. And so, indeed, into the wounds of the world today, salt needs to be poured. And as strange as that may sound, it indeed does provide an effective aspect to it insofar as that it prevents the infection of sin from spreading and growing worse. And this contrasts, of course, with pouring something sweeter like sugar into wounds, which would only aid in sin and in bacteria spreading. And so in the first reading today, Isaiah lists many things that the faithful can do so that light shall break forth like the dawn, and that Israel's wound may be healed. And in doing so, he spoke of the most pressing issues of the time. He spoke of the need to loosen the bonds of injustice, letting the oppressed go free, sharing bread with the hungry, sheltering the homeless, clothing the naked, etc., etc. Governments did not do these things back then. It was the faithful who carried out these tasks. Today, thankfully, through the witness of the church and the faithful, many of these social and moral issues are today addressed by the governments. But not all of them are. And so there are many, in fact, moral issues today that the world does not yet agree and has come to see the light of the church on. Specifically, those teachings with regards to marriage and human sexuality. And if the church does not give a witness in these areas, no one will. And so Christ continues to call us to be the salt of the earth, to heal the world's wounds, by letting the light of Christ shine forth in radiant splendor. At first, it may be something that is not easily or well received, but by being that salt of the earth, healing may be experienced, and ultimately, the peace of Christ may be realized.